When you walk in the projects, you can't help but feel frustrated. You see so much raw, untapped potential here. You see it in the sparkle of the little kids' eyes. But you doubt if that energy will ever be put to its best use. Instead, there are the banal, soul-sapping realities of ghetto life. Drugs, violence, disease, and despair. I know. I came from here. My name is Walter Williams, and I'm an economist. Why does this poverty persist? The easiest thing to do is to choose a scapegoat. Capitalism, racism, vandalism, communism. Instead, some economists, including me, are trying to apply the scientific tools of economic analysis to the problems of poverty. The results of our work often go against the traditional arguments. In the next few minutes, I'd like to talk about some of the findings that I write about in my book, The State Against Blacks. Afterward, we'll let the sparks fly as some colleagues of mine debate the issues. The civil rights marches of the 1960s woke up America's consciousness and helped end racist practices. That was good and necessary. But in the 1980s, racism doesn't go very far in explaining why American blacks are behind other groups. Racism exists. It exists everywhere. African blacks discriminate against Arabs. Japanese discriminate against Koreans. Malaysians against Chinese, ad infinitum. Yet discrimination hasn't prevented some of these groups from succeeding. Rather than racism, it is the economic rules of the game that are handicapping blacks today. These rules are the many federal, state, and local laws that regulate economic activity. A lot of these laws discriminate against people who happen to be outsiders or latecomers to the economy, or those who have few economic resources. Because of their tragic history in the United States, blacks fall into that class of people more than most other groups. I see government not as the solution to our problems anymore, but as the problem. Government rules and regulations have rigged the economy against poor people. These rules, many of which were enacted in the 1930s, have cut poor blacks out of the kind of upward mobility that let other ethnic groups, Jews, Italians, Irish, and Polish, pull themselves out of poverty. By the time blacks became urbanized and received the franchise through the 1964 Civil Rights Act, they had almost been locked out of the private economy. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, birthplace of the Declaration of Independence. Hiding in the shadows of Philadelphia's skyline is North Philadelphia, the Black Ghetto. At the heart of North Philadelphia sits a sprawling, aging conglomeration of cheap apartment buildings known as the Richard Allen Housing Project. It was built in 1941 to house the poor. I know the Richard Allen Project well. When I was a kid, we lived there. My father deserted us when I was 3. Like other tenants at the Richard Allen Project, my mother was on and off welfare. She never liked taking it, so she did days' work as a domestic. She raised my sister and me all by herself. She was a proud woman. When I was a kid growing up in the project, I didn't have much time for games. I worked since I was 10 years old. I shined shoes, I delivered packages, I washed dishes at Horn and Hardart. But the kids today are different. They can't find work, so they play basketball and maybe dream of making the Philadelphia 76ers. Back in 1948, before dramatic increases in the minimum wage law, black youth unemployment was 9.4%. Today, it stays at 50% or more. That isn't because employers have become more racist. We can't even blame today's black youth unemployment on recession. No, the culprit here is the minimum wage law. The minimum wage law is telling our young people that if they can't produce $3.35 an hour of goods or services, then they are not worthy of a job at all. This is so because the minimum wage law requires every employer to pay a worker at least $3.35 an hour, no matter how unskilled that worker may be. However, the businessman has to look at more than that $3.35 an hour. he also has to pay Social Security, unemployment compensation, and fringes such as insurance. So the actual cost to the employer is around $4 an hour, even for the lowest skilled worker. A lot of 16-year-olds just don't have the capacity to produce that amount of goods and services an hour. Kids are kids. They're inexperienced, they're immature, they haven't formed good work habits. Maybe a teenager can only produce $2 an hour worth of goods and services. It is a losing economic proposition for an employer to pay somebody $3.35 an hour when that person can only produce $2 an hour worth of goods and services. There was a time when even small neighborhood movie theaters had 3 or more ushers to show moviegoers to their seats. Now go to the biggest downtown movie theaters and there are few ushers. The reason why ushers are not in theaters is not because Americans of today like to stumble to their seats in the dark. No, the reason is that the minimum wage law has eliminated that sort of low-skilled job. Fast food restaurants like McDonald's and Burger King install high-tech electronic gear to do the jobs that teenagers once did. Automatic dishwashers have taken over from teenage dishwashers in restaurant kitchens. It is worse than that, though. Not only has the minimum wage law eliminated a lot of low-skilled jobs, it has also caused a lot of other low-skilled jobs not ever to be created in the first place. Nowadays, kids reach the age of 25 without ever having had a work experience. The only profession open to some of them is crime. It's damn unfortunate. If these bad effects of the minimum wage law only meant that some kids were being deprived of spending change, maybe we could just chalk it up to foolish government intervention and forget it. But not so fast. Early work experience gives kids a lot more than spending money. It teaches kids how to find a job in the first place. It teaches them that they can't come to work with a blaring radio. It teaches them that they have to come in on Friday, even if they got paid on Thursday. It teaches them that they can't spit in the foreman's face and still keep their job. Working gives a sense of pride, too. It is the kind of pride that comes from being at least a little bit financially independent. A kid knows he's an adult when he brings home that first paycheck.
Why didn't you use is? All right, I'm not referring to the one that directly preceded it. I'm going back to the first footnote. So consequently,
the minimum wage law puts black teenagers in a double bind. First, the public schools deliver a fraudulent education to ghetto teenagers. Many graduate from high schools not knowing how to read or write or do math at even a 6th grade level. If they're going to learn anything that will make them valuable employees in the future, they're obviously not going to learn it in the public school system. At the same time, the minimum wage law denies these kids the alternative of going out and learning job skills in the marketplace. They're cut out from learning job skills at school and cut out from learning job skills at work. These kids do not have too much hope for success in the economy. A lot of good-hearted people advocate the minimum wage law as a way to end poverty and protect the worker from what they see as exploitation. Well, you know the minimum wage law is not an anti-poverty device. If it were, we could eliminate poverty in Bangladesh just by raising the minimum wage there to $5 an hour. As for protecting the worker, the minimum wage law only protects those skilled enough to produce at least $3.35 an hour of goods. People who aren't skilled enough to produce that value of goods are thrown out of work. They earn $0 an hour. When do-gooders set out to protect people, often they never see the victims of their handiwork. For instance, the federal government not too long ago ordered a raid on a garment sweatshop in New York City. The shop had been paying an elderly woman only $1 an hour, and some kids were working in the shop for similar wages. The owner was fined, and he had to stop what he had been doing. When the social do-gooders come back to the sweatshop, they'll around and congratulate themselves on the fact that everyone in the shop is now earning $3.35 an hour. What these do-gooders don't see is whatever happened to that old lady who was making $1 an hour. She might have become a bag lady roaming the streets for all we know. Those kids who had jobs at the shop are probably standing on some street corner stealing hubcaps or worse. The minimum wage law does something else too. It reduces the cost to an employer of engaging in plain racial discrimination. If a businessman has to pay any worker $3.35 an hour, assuming all the job applicants have the same qualifications, then the cost of choosing white workers over black ones is zero. If there were no minimum wage law, poor black job seekers could engage in the age-old strategy of offering their services at a slightly lower rate. If a black worker agreed to work for $3 an hour, while white workers wouldn't accept anything less than $4 an hour, it would pay the employer to hire the black workers, regardless of his feelings. But the minimum wage law prohibits low-skilled blacks from offering that kind of competitive advantage. In South Africa, the world capital of racism, the white labor unions favor the minimum wage law because that law helps hold together racist apartheid laws that would otherwise break down. For example, back in 1972, a black South African home construction worker would make 40 cents an hour, while a white construction worker would earn $1.90 for doing the same job. South African home builders had a lot of incentive to ignore the segregation laws and hire the lower-priced black labor. What happened is that the white construction unions began insisting on an equal pay for equal work law. Then the South African builder would have no special reason to hire black workers, and he wouldn't hire them. What we really ought to do is abolish the minimum wage law. Another law that hurts blacks especially is the kind that forces anyone to get a license before he can practice a skilled trade or start a business. Back in the 1920s, an illiterate, poor Italian immigrant who had hardly any money could go out and buy a used Model T Ford and write the word taxi on it. He was in business for himself. Empires got started that way. Today, that would be against the law in many cities. Today, a poor person needs more than industry and ambition. For example, if he lives in New York, he needs $65,000 or more to buy a taxi license. Otherwise, the only way he can become a taxi owner-operator in New York is to go outside the law and operate a gypsy unlicensed cab. He can do that as long as he doesn't mind serving only the worst New York slums and being harassed by police and legitimate cab drivers. Sculpting and treating hair is an honorable calling, and one that is accessible to people whose formal education is less than ideal. So you think. But some economists who looked into the mischief caused by occupational licensing laws found otherwise. They picked Missouri and Illinois to study and found a large proportion of black beauty school students failed the beautician's license exam. When they looked closer, they saw that actually there were two tests. One is the practical test in which students actually do hair. The other is a written test that asks a lot of complicated questions which don't have much to do with beautician work. The economists discovered that black students did fine on the practical test, but their poor education shot them down on the written test. Ironically, the written test proved to have nothing to do with whether you would become a good beautician. So the black students could do hair and do it well, but they were denied beautician licenses. It's another case of the double bind for blacks. Their poor performance on the written portion of the beautician's exam shows up their rotten education. Then when they try to get into a skilled vocation, they are still penalized for that rotten education. The people who support this kind of occupational licensing invariably are the ones already in the profession. They call for high standards, but what they really mean is high prices. They want to limit entry into the profession to keep competition down. Nowadays, the minimum wage laws and occupational licensing laws tell poor people that if they can't grab hold of the middle rungs of the economic ladder, then they don't get on at all. We've lopped off the bottom rungs. The down and outers of yesterday had some opportunities to escape. But the down and outers of today just have the welfare system. This is especially tragic for the black poor, whose historical experience in this country is that of slavery and dependence, not free enterprise. If you create a system in which the poorest people make more money by being on the dole than they can possibly make by working, the rational thing for them to do is to choose the dole. If you count cash welfare payments, food stamps, Medicaid, housing subsidies, and the like, an average welfare family of four gets $8,000 to $10,000 tax-free a year. Most of them probably aren't able to get a job that pays enough to bring home that amount of pay in after-tax dollars. Welfare makes sense for them. But yet these same folks would probably be very happy to start their own enterprises and pay their own way. Often they can't. The economic rules of the game won't allow it. Rules and regulations will tangle up the small entrepreneur before he can get started. If he tries to turn his car into a taxicab, he might wind up in jail. If he wants to open a beauty shop, he'd better have all the licenses he needs or he'll be shut down. Poor people stay poor generally for one of two reasons. Either they have nothing to sell in the marketplace, or they have something to sell but are prevented from selling it by government laws. The people who have nothing to sell are usually the severely handicapped or children. But a huge number of the poor in the U.S. fit that second category of people who have something to sell but are prevented from selling it by rules and regulations. 50 years ago or less, people were a lot freer to go into business for themselves. In those times, a man or woman could simply offer his or her services as an electrician or a landscaper or what have you. If a would-be entrepreneur tries that now, some city inspector will come around and ask if he has a license. If he doesn't, he's out of luck, regardless of how well he can perform the service he's selling. Black people need to refocus their attention toward the ultimate cause of many of their problems. Many of the economic problems that blacks face are the result of government rigging the rules of the game against outsiders, latecomers, and those with few resources. Now it is time for blacks to direct their energies towards deregulation of the economy instead of the usual program of quotas and set-asides, which promote racial antagonisms. I can see a natural political coalition that could focus on deregulation. Think about those New York City taxicabs again. The people who benefit from the high cost of getting a taxi license in the city of New York are few in number. They are the New York cab drivers who happen to own taxi licenses. On the other hand, multitudes of people bear the burden of the high cost of those taxi licenses. All the taxi riders in the city would benefit from the lower cost and better service that would result if the taxi business were opened up in New York. The other beneficiaries would be the small-time entrepreneurs who wanted to become taxi owner-operators. You put together those would-be taxi owners and those many taxi riders, and you have a powerful group. They could join hands to break open the taxi market for the benefit of everyone. We could also apply the government's own antitrust laws against occupational licensing regulations. The antitrust laws prohibit practices that restrain free trade. Most occupational licensing laws do just that. A courageous United States president could bring a barrage of these kinds of antitrust lawsuits to open up the marketplace to today's poor. But these are still political remedies. The most successful minority groups in this country have found it practical to forget political remedies. They go after economic remedies instead. The Koreans in America are a good example. Most arrived on these shores a few years ago without much education or money. They worked at low-level jobs just to save up capital. Then they used the capital to start small businesses in areas that aren't heavily regulated. These Koreans get around the minimum wage law by having members of the family work in their restaurants or vegetable stands. They avoid other regulations by dealing strictly in cash. But most of all, these immigrants are willing to work hard, around the clock, building an economic foundation. Today, after only a few short years, Koreans in New York and Los Angeles have become an economic force. Their political influence, when and if it comes, will be based solidly on an economic foundation. But American blacks have been led astray by civil rights leaders who claim that political power is necessary for economic success. This was a major strategic error. It has made many American blacks too reliant on government largesse. The free market economy is good for black people. Black civil rights leaders have for too long tried to protect blacks from the free market by various quotas and subsidies. What they don't realize is that people who are discriminated against do better under a system where the market decides who gets what. When choices are made on the basis of politics, minorities may not get any of what they want simply because they can be outvoted. In a free market, every man has a vote based on the number of dollars he possesses. When choices are made in the impersonal marketplace, everyone has a good chance of getting at least some of what he wants. The color of a dollar bill is not black or white. The color of a dollar bill is green.
The views expressed in the film you've just seen are those of Dr. Walter Williams, adapted from his book, The State Against Blacks. Dr. Williams is professor of economics at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. Among those who have a different view is Dr. Bernard Anderson, Director of Social Sciences at the Rockefeller Foundation and Professor of Industry at the Wharton School of Finance and Commerce at the University of Pennsylvania. Here for some political reaction is Congressman Charles Rangel of the 16th Congressional District of Manhattan, representing Harlem and parts of the Upper East and West Sides. Congressman Rangel is the third-ranking Democrat on the House Ways and Means Committee. Dr. Anderson, let me just start so we can get a bit of an overview here. How do you respond to Dr. Williams' basic argument that it's the economic rules of the game, government rules and regulations, that are handicapping blacks far more than racism?
Well, I think it's fair to say that it is a somewhat simplistic argument, which has perhaps some validity in it, but when viewed in relation to the overall position of blacks, probably is not sufficiently responsive to the complexity of the situation in which black people find themselves. And I think at the very least it's fair to say that it's a curious argument to suggest that the solution to the economic problems of black people is to return to the sweatshop. And I don't think that that is a full analysis of the problem.
So basically you don't buy the argument?
No, I think there's no question that there are some elements of our economy that help explain the economic position of black people, that much of the racism that existed in the country many years ago no longer exists. There has been a decline in discrimination, and many of the current expressions of economic disadvantage which blacks experience are undoubtedly related to the characteristics of the American economy. But that is not to say that the rules of the game represent the principal explanation for the economic position that blacks occupy at this time.
Congressman Rangel, let me just ask you on another point, that too much emphasis has been given to race and politics in fashioning remedies for black problems.
It all depends on which side of the coin you want to look at. I would rather believe that even in the Congressional Black Caucus, which I'm a member, we don't have black legislation. We have legislation that tries to deal with the problems of the poor. It's unfortunate that when you're poor and you're black, that you carry a double burden, and that being black in this country, and of course in many other countries, makes it more difficult for you to get out of that poverty bind. You talk about the doctor stimulating debate. I don't think there's too much debate or supporting his position. Those kids that are still in the project that he was born and or raised in are not going to get out of that ghetto by eliminating the minimum wage, by reducing standards so that those that have their hair done would not be licensed, or by talking about black folks being hired because they're expecting less to be paid than white people. And I might add that If you start doing that and stigmatizing the black worker, where he says this will bring some type of equalization, as soon as the wage goes down, it's clear to me that white folks will be coming in at that minimum wage or whatever the lower wage is, and we're right back to the racist attitudes that the blacks will be bumped again.
Okay, we're going to get into some specifics of the argument, but let me just have you respond to those general observations about your thesis.
Well,
Dr.
I think there are numerous examples, and I disagree with Dr. Anderson. I think there are numerous examples of how people use government power to exclude blacks. For example, in the Reconstruction period in the United States, blacks did a whole lot of construction as skilled masons, skilled stonemasons, and builders. They built the Market Center in Washington. They built 4 schools under black supervision, mind you. Now, there are many, many blacks doing these jobs. So what do you think? Did they get up and say, well, we're tired of being carpenters anymore? No. It was the labor unions using government power to exclude blacks through licensing laws, through collective bargaining agreements that were backed up by government. Blacks were 98% of the firemen on railroads in our country at one time, and by 1960 they were 4%. The way they got out was through the Railway Act that was in 1924, and numerous other actions by the unions using government power. And so you can't quite say, well, the railroads today are more discriminatory than they were back in the 1800s. That explains the absence of blacks.
Are you
in the railroads.
excluding the unions from racism? If there's a decent jobs that blacks have had and whites take a look at the job, whether they do it through government regulation or union regulation, doesn't mean that those successful blacks were not the victims of racism, whether it's union or government.
Well, no, but I'm saying that even though there was racism in the United States, you could not prevent blacks from being 98% of the firemen. It was only until unions got the power to use government that they could exclude, because those blacks that were working on railroads, they were working for $1.25 a day. White firemen, they wanted $2.50 a day. What would a railroad guy do? He wants to hire the cheapest labor source. And it wasn't until the unions were able to impose equal pay for equal work laws and other kinds of licensing restrictions that blacks were eliminated from railroads.
Dr. Anderson, what about the point that Dr. Williams also makes, that even where discrimination exists, if he acknowledges that even in the case of discrimination, other minority groups, immigrant groups, have been able to make it up the economic opportunity ladder, whereas blacks have not?
Well, I think that that's an indication of the degree of discrimination against black people. Black people are the only ones in this country who were brought here in chains. They're the only ones who have suffered from the pervasive, comprehensive, year after year segregation and discrimination. There's no other group that has suffered to the degree that black people in this country have suffered from the many different kinds of discrimination that has been visited upon the black community. A very good study of this was conducted by Judge Leon Higginbotham in a comprehensive study that he has conducted of the laws in this country that have put black people in shackles over the years. And so, yes, there is evidence of other immigrant groups having come to the country and moved ahead despite the fact that they have suffered some discrimination. But I think that we're talking here about relative degrees of discrimination, and we should not forget the tremendous effect of racism in American society as an explanatory factor for the conditions in which blacks find themselves today.
Well, I would disagree. First of all, I would say that the statistics show that West Indian American blacks, they make more money than the average white at the median. So it's not necessarily all blacks. Now, but on the other hand, I know of no group in history that has faced as much discrimination as Jews. That is, no group ever tried to exterminate blacks, but they did try to exterminate Jews and had very harsh laws. But Jews, no matter where you find them, they tend to earn the higher income. Chinese in Southeast Asia, they face massive expulsions from time to time, but yet Chinese are the highest income earners in Southeast Asia. So all I'm saying, I'm not saying that there's no racial discrimination. I'm not saying that racial discrimination does not have any effect. I'm saying just how much of what we see does it explain. And I argue that just does not explain everything as people would have the public believe.
I would not argue.
What I really wonder is whether or not the good doctor would be nearly as successful as he is today, that if he did not take these extraordinary, bizarre positions, which I doubt seriously that he believes. The doctor's known for being on television shows, reporting in front of United States Senate position.
Congress, you should not attack me personally.
Writing books, which makes him different from a lot of other people. There's no question that a good doctor, with all of his qualifications, all he has to do is take a walk through the South Boston, or South Africa for that matter, to be reminded of the racism that exists in this country and indeed in the world. And so I'm saying that if he had to compete in taking just an ordinary position as an economist, I'm thoroughly convinced that he would not be as successful as he is today.
Well, I have walked through South Africa, and I have found out, by the way, that the Black Caucus of the United States, your colleagues, you support the same kind of laws that racist unions in South Africa support.
All right, well, let's get to the specific of those laws in that case, because we're getting to the crux of this argument now that government really is a part of the problem. Dr. Williams has said that discrimination has been exacerbated, if I could paraphrase your position, by government rules and regulations. Dr. Anderson, black unemployment today, as you know, stands at almost 20%, which is more than double white unemployment, and black youth unemployment is said to be at least 50%. Dr. Williams has just said in his essay that this is a prime example of government as culprit, that high levels of black unemployment have existed in good times and bad since the passage of the minimum wage law. Is he not right?
Well, it's interesting. There's no question that unemployment among black teenagers has increased at the same time there have been increases in the minimum wage. But to suggest that the minimum wage is responsible for the serious unemployment problem among black teenagers is the same thing as saying that the Washington Redskins' victory in the Super Bowl was caused by the messianic enthusiasm of its fans. Obviously, there were other factors involved.
Yeah, but one of the points that he makes is that before the minimum wage, black unemployment was at about 9%. Once the minimum wage was introduced, then it ratcheted steadily upwards.
The point that I think should be made, Charlene, is that there have been a lot of trends in the American economy, and especially in areas where blacks live, other than the imposition of minimum wages, since the earlier period that Walter referred to. Let me explain some of the things that have happened over the last 30 years. We have seen the in-migration of large numbers of blacks from rural areas of the South into the urban areas of the North. When they were in the rural areas of the South, they were not counted as unemployed, in part because they were underemployed if they were participating in the labor market at all. But when they move into cities like New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, they're then counted as unemployed. Secondly, in those very communities in which you find the highest rates of unemployment, over the last 30 years there has been a deterioration in the number of jobs. There has been a deterioration in the commercial and business infrastructure. There has been a transformation in industry, a decline in manufacturing jobs. There have been a number of changes that have occurred in these communities that help explain why teenagers, and black teenagers in particular, have a higher unemployment rate than white teenagers. And it's not just the minimum wage.
All right, that's a mouthful. Let me get Dr. Williams to respond to those 2 points.
I will respond. I think it won't impress my colleague very much, but it might impress the audience. And that is, if you want to know where there's general agreement on something, well, you just kind of go to the elementary textbooks that are used in the field, you know, elementary economics textbooks. Now, if you go to any elementary economics textbook that says anything about minimum wage law, 92% of them will say that the minimum wage law handicaps the most disadvantaged worker. Now, this is the economics profession generally showing a concession. That is, generally showing agreement on it. Now,
but what about the 2 points that you raised that are mitigating factors?
Okay, now there's something here that the deterioration of the economic community in cities was not an act of God itself. That is, when businesses have to pay, say, $3.35 an hour to no matter who they hire, well, if they don't find a pool of labor around where they are, they will shift somewhere else, or they'll automate, or they'll just won't use labor-intensive production.
Okay, all right, let's just take that.
But there is a question of evidence here, and I think we need to look at the evidence. I have been an economist for long enough to know what those textbooks say. But it's very interesting that there's a difference between the theoretical expectation about the impact of the minimum wage and the empirical evidence. In 1982, after a long and exhaustive study conducted by the congressionally mandated Minimum Wage Study Commission, the conclusion was that the minimum wage is not the primary factor responsible for black teenage unemployment.
Wrong. No,
all right, but
that was the conclusion of the commissioners. Now, if you read through the other 7 volumes of the reports of the professional studies in there, most of those economists that did the professional studies said that the minimum wage law has a devastating effect on teenagers. And furthermore, they recommended sub-minimum wage.
All right,
but I just don't want you to mislead the public by looking at volume 7, because that was the conclusion of the political figure.
But I want to give another statistic.
Dr. Anderson, let me just get you to respond to Dr. Williams' point about the business deterioration being a factor. Why his explanation of the business deterioration is very different from yours.
Well, what he's saying is that the minimum wage caused it all. That if there's any problem in the inner city, it was caused by the minimum wage, and clearly that is not correct.
But what about his position that the minimum wage did, in fact, eliminate the kinds of jobs that low-skilled young people would be after, like the ushers in the theater and so forth, and prevented other
Western Union, for example?
I don't doubt that the minimum wage probably has had some effect on the number of jobs, but there are opportunities within existing law for employers to hire teenagers at lower than the minimum wage, and I'd give you 2 pieces of information on this. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act that is now in existence, an employer can hire a teenager at less than the minimum wage, but that program has been undersubscribed by private employers from the very time it was put on the law book. Secondly,
you mean they're not using it?
They're not using it. The point is that
the law now
that they're not using the exemptions available in law. Secondly,
the bureaucratic things that you have to do it. It makes it prohibitively expensive for somebody other than McDonald's, who hires many teenagers, to go through that process.
I'd like to give you another bit of evidence. Between 1977 and 1980, the Congress supported an act called the Youth Incentive Entitlement Program. Under that program, an employer in 17 designated communities throughout this country could hire disadvantaged teenagers at no cost. All the teenager had to do was to remain in school or to return to school for a part-time job during the school year or a full-time job during the summer. Now, under that program, a teenager was available to employers at no cost, yet less than 23% of all jobs available under that program to minority youth, and I'm talking here about 73,000 jobs, less than 23% of them were made available by the private sector.
So your point is what?
My point is that the minimum wage is not the primary factor responsible for the unemployment of black youth, and that is confirmed by studies I have conducted myself.
Well, what do you...
May I respond just to the question of the minimum wage? Because if you take the doctor's argument further, he uses this sweatshop example. I'm a little shocked and surprised, saying, what would the do-gooders do if they find out that the teenager or the minority or the old woman was not working for $1 an hour? All of the problems as to why teenagers and others, lack of skills, lack of productivity, has nothing to do with the minimum wage, which was designed by the Congress to put some type of a bottom as to what people should be able to get for goods and services. If the argument is that certain people don't reach that expectation of $3.35, it would seem to me that it would be in the interest of the country, certainly our poor and our black, to increase access through training programs to make certain that they would be productive. But I'm suggesting this, that if you eliminate it altogether and allow the $1 an hour to work, and it's silly to talk about this when over 11 million people are unemployed anyway, what is the difference between the good doctor suggestion and the slavery system where people who are in need of food and shelter are willing to pick cotton without any type of standards? Somebody has to do it. And it's not a foreign argument, because we do have illegals that come into the country doing just that. And we do have migrant laborers doing just that.
Because that's beside the point. But the point
migrant laborers are laborers.
I think that there's something for all of us to see. Now, Dr. Anderson, and I believe the congressman, wanted to say that the minimum wage law has no effect or just insignificant effect on teenage unemployment. But let's anticipate what they're going to say with response to another question. You say, well, let's have a sub-minimum wage law for young people. Now, both these guys will respond that they're against a sub-minimum wage law because they'll give firms incentives to hire kids and fire the fathers. I'm quite sure that they're going to say that. But if the minimum wage law has no effect, see they want to have it on both sides. They want to have the cake and eat it too. First, they want to say it has no effect, and then we recommend a policy to deal with some of the effects of the minimum wage law. Then you're going to say, no, I'm against that because it will cause unemployment among older people. So which is it? Does the minimum wage law have an effect, or does it not?
I don't see.
Well, are you supporting the sub-minimum? You're not supporting.
Oh, it's ridiculous. What would
happen with the sub-minimum wage? What would happen?
What you could be talking about
let me clarify
workers.
something. When you talk about the sub-minimum wage, just as a point of clarification, you're talking about paying teenagers principally at a wage less than the minimum wage.
Yeah,
right?
And not because of any proof that they're less productive, but merely because they're young.
No.
And I'm saying that if I had a job, well, you're not running the show, Doctor. You had your essay.
I know.
I'm saying that if I had a job, and I lack the skills, and my God, who is skilled? I mean, today you find a lot of steel workers unemployed, automobile workers unemployed. And suppose I wasn't able to do a job too well, but I got the minimum wage, and some youngster, probably having the same background as the good doctor, was able to produce more. It'd be ridiculous for me to keep my job for $3.35 when this kid can come in for $2. And so it doesn't mean it created a job, it exchanged a job.
So you mean if you lower the wage for the teenager, it will cause him to be employed and will lose somebody else?
I'm saying that if you lower the wage, it seems to me that any good employer, if they can find out that kids, and I'm not saying white kids, but kids that have been more exposed to training, that have good training, that you might as well hire the kid for $2 than you would hire the black for $3.
So if you lower the wage, more kids will get jobs, right?
Kids may. And
okay, well that's what we're talking about.
Okay, well let me
saying that you can lower the wage for blacks under your example.
I'm not saying lower the wage for blacks.
But wait just a minute, Congressman. Let me just ask, because this is part of the point that Dr. Anderson made, that there already exist provisions to pay teenagers less than the minimum wage.
I believe it's 85%.
Right.
Now, many teenagers, they're not even worth, in terms of the productive output, 85% of the minimum wage law. Maybe there are some teenagers
but the point was that business isn't even taking advantage of that.
Okay, that's right. One of the reasons when you apply for that, you have to certify that you're not going to lay off an adult to hire the kid.
Well,
now,
wouldn't that
pretty
happen?
hard. That's pretty hard to prove.
Then you prove that it can happen.
No, I'm saying that's pretty hard to prove.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you have any concern that with this system of a sub-minimum, that this would happen, that business would get rid of the older worker and hire the less experienced teenager because he could pay him less?
Well, I would say that there would be some substitution. It wouldn't be total substitution. The overall effect would be an increase in total number of jobs. That is, hotels may decide to keep their corridors cleaner by hiring some kids to sweep out the floors. At movies may hire ushers again, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a moral question here. There's a moral question. And I'd like to ask the congressman, since he represents the people in the United States, I would like to ask him, what is the moral basis for the government protecting one American's job at the expense of another American? Aren't we all Americans equal to one another, whether you're 16 years old or whether you're 40 years old? Why should government be in the business, at the bequest of unions, by the way, of protecting one American's job at the expense of another American's job?
I thought it was you that was suggesting that we should have a double tier.
No, I'm asking that question. You're not going to answer that one.
We're saying that the minimum wage is a protection for everyone. You're the one that's suggesting that we should have 2 tiers. I like to talk about your sweatshop.
No. I'm not going to let you get away that easily. No, what you said.
Had your sweatshop.
We have to have sentences that are complete, and we can't hear complete sentences if everybody's talking at once. Make your point, Dr. Williams, and then we can move on.
I'm saying that the moral question is why the congressman has already said that if we have a sub-minimum wage law for young people, a firm might fire the father and hire the son, right? I'm asking, Why? What is the moral basis of government protecting one person's job at the expense of another person's job?
Doctor, I don't know whether you're doing this deliberately. You're asking why should the Congress have a lower tier and allow certain people, whether they're young or whether they're black, to get paid less, which you're talking about the teenager, at the expense of the higher paid. What we do is we have one tier, and that's the minimum wage. You're suggesting that we should be able to bring in people, and you also suggested in your so-called essay that the black folks would be able to come in without the protection and would be hired at a lesser salary because you could look at them at they're black and say that they would lack productivity and that they would be hired. What we're saying is that instead of having a competition between the more skilled that is working and the unskilled, whether they're youngsters or whether they're other people, don't remove the protection that Congress had, but use your resources to bring the youngster and to bring the other with less skills up to the minimum wage standard. It seems to me to be fairer.
Let me just ask Dr. Anderson if the proposal that Dr. Williams has made doesn't seem to meet the problem. We have 50% unemployment for young people, and all expectations are that it will get higher. What's your alternative?
Well, two things. First of all, my alternative would be a targeted jobs tax credit. The 50% unemployment that you refer to for black teenagers is substantially higher than that for white teenagers. And what that means is that the most serious part of the youth unemployment problem in this country is among black and Hispanic minority youth. Therefore, in order to attack the problem, it seems reasonable to me that you need a tool that can be targeted on the young people in greatest need. A sub-minimum wage is not targeted. There's no question that a sub-minimum wage, if it would help any teenagers at all, would be of disproportionate benefit to non-minority teenagers, not to minority teenagers. But let me deal with the
all right, we have to move on, so let's deal with it. Let me just
very quickly, though, on the moral issue. I'd like to answer that question very quickly. The moral issue is really a constitutional question. As I read the Constitution, and I'm not an attorney, there's a word in there about the government protecting the general welfare. It seems to me that the labor standards that we have in this country have been legislated by the Congress and approved by the President in order to provide for the general welfare. And that is the reason we have these kinds of laws for occupational licensing and all the rest. And we've made substantial progress in this country over the years in eliminating child labor, in eliminating low labor standards, and we need to maintain that in the interest of producing a better quality of life for all the people.
Well, let's hear what the doctor has to say.
Well, I would say that, well, you know, the minimum wage law, and there are other super minimum wage law that the congressman supports.
But he also includes now occupational licensing, which I'd also like to include.
I think that, now I can't say how anybody can support, let's say, a $65,000 license price to own and operate a taxi, or $40,000 license price.
We have liveries that don't need that $65,000.
I understand.
So you're in the wrong town for that analogy.
No.
You don't need a medallion to run a cab in New York City.
All right, what is your point?
No, I'm saying that the $65,000 license price excludes people from operating in the legal market. In Washington, and in cities that have these high, like Philadelphia, Philadelphia's license is $20,000. And 3% of those taxis are owned by blacks, and Philadelphia is a 40% black city. But Washington, D.C., 70 or 80% of the taxis are owned by blacks, owned and operated by blacks. Now, you can't say that there is no racial discrimination in Washington, D.C., and plenty of it in Philadelphia. That explains that. No, the license price, the license is under $200 in Washington, D.C.
But what about the livery operators?
The livery business, these people are licensed by the state of New York, as opposed to a taxicab limousine commission in the city. Now, what they have to do, they by law, people have to walk into their place or call them.
That's not so.
They cannot
You're not familiar with the law. They're cruising now with the mayor's
maybe it has just recently changed, hasn't it?
Well, you're just using a bad example because they've always picked up. They've always cruised.
Congressman, no, I think that if you defend the kind of licensing that rigs out people, such as the taxicab case, I think it's just perfectly disgusting.
Well, you use beauticians, and I would not want my mother, sister, or wife to be going to a beautician that didn't have some type of licensing.
Do you think
we got a lot of
do you think it should be against the law? You think it should be against the law that my wife cannot do my daughter's hair?
If you take take a test, you're assuming the black can't pass the test.
Congressman, all right, we have to clarify something here. Dr. Williams, how would you assure the public, in the absence of licensing, that standards were being maintained and that there would not be abuses?
Well, there's a certification process. That is where if you want to learn or go to a particular school, you would be certified as, let's say a grade A beautician. If you scored another lower score on the examination by the certification board, maybe a grade C or whatever, and then let Congressman Rangel decide whether he wants to go to the grade A or grade D or whatever.
Moderator, how we had that system for New York school teachers where some white teacher would determine whether or not a black teacher was certified, and it just didn't work out the way you're suggesting.
No, but I'm saying that in the licensing field, certification does not exclude anybody. Certification attests to the public the quality of the services that are expected, and let the public decide what quality of services.
Gentlemen, we're just about out of
doing well as beautician work here in the Senate.
We're just about out of time, and I want to get to Dr. Williams' overall conclusion that now is the time for blacks to channel their energies toward deregulation of the economy instead of the usual quotas and set-aside programs, which he argues do little other than create racial antagonisms, that the marketplace is where these adjustments now have to be made, and the political and other emphasis have to give way to that. What's your response, very briefly, to that,
The agenda of
Doctor?
interest for black leadership working on behalf of a better quality of life for black people is not just affirmative action and set-asides. It's to get the government of this country to deal with the present effects of past discrimination that is still a very serious barrier to the full participation of black people in this country. And to say that all of those efforts, which I won't take the time to mention now, should be set aside in the interest of a major effort against deregulation, I think is just to sell blacks down the river so far as any advancement in the race is concerned.
We have to admit that when you're crippled by 300 years of racism, that a nation that has any moral fiber should reach out to try to rehabilitate, as we did with soldiers, as the good doctor was the beneficiary of, to give some help to allow someone truly to be competitive in the marketplace. But one of the things, unfortunately, that has happened with blacks and other people is that some of us that are fortunate enough to receive the degrees, to be accepted, that are truly able to compete, leave the arena, and there are very few role models for blacks really to attach to. And so I think that by leaving the community, by not getting involved, and by taking positions that they don't need any extra help, just let them compete, is really self-defeating.
Dr. Williams, you argue that the traditional approaches, education, political, and government programs and so on, are really not the way for blacks to go about solving their problems in the future. Where do you think the black community should turn for help in the future in solving its problems?
Well, I think basically the black community depends on itself to solve its own problems. That is, if we will say, that is, find their own options, their own problems, like the atrocious education that black people receive in our communities. Well, they shouldn't look to the Board of Education anymore because the Board of Education has been robbing them. They should look towards a voucher system, let them find their own solutions, let them get out, let them fire these rotten schools.
In other words, but your position is that the government should not be involved in solving these problems.
Well, my position is that, and plus the point, going back to what Dr. Anderson said, I think one of the best ways to sell black people down the river is to make them dependent on government largesse. Presidents come and go, Congress moods change, and I don't want to make black people subject to political whims.
You have 5 seconds.
We all are dependent on the public structure, especially poor people. If the doctor would destroy that and allow us to be just victims of the private sector, I'm certain there'd be no hope for our youngsters in this generation.
I'm sorry, we have to leave it there, but perhaps another time we can come back. Clearly these issues are going to be with us in the days and months ahead, but I'm sure I speak on behalf of the panel when I say that I hope this discussion will at least inform your thinking as you confront these issues. My thanks to members of the panel and to you for being with us. I'm Charlene Hunter Gault. Good night.